Hello, my name is Carrie Singleton. I'm a registered nurse in the rural community of Southeast Texas. Today, I will address a group who are particularly vulnerable to disasters, but often have been less considered in research and disaster risk interventions. This group are people experiencing homelessness. Most publicized efforts to promote preparedness typically focus on people who are housed and have resources to stockpile food and supplies and also shelter in place. For the purpose of this teaching project, my scope includes disaster planners and responders set in place to assist persons who do not have a permanent home and are sleeping outdoors or in improvised dwellings in non-metro rural communities. According to the National Coalition of the Homeless, homelessness and poverty are inseparably linked. Poor people are frequently unable to pay for housing, food, child care, health care, and education. Difficult choices must be made when limited resources cover only some of these necessities. Often, it is housing which absorbs a high proportion of income that must be dropped. If you are poor, you are essentially an illness, an accident, or paycheck away from poverty. In 2011, the official poverty rate in the U.S. was 15%. There were 46.2 million people living in poverty. Not all homelessness is straightforward. There are classifications of homelessness: urban, rural, and transient. Homelessness is often assumed to be an urban phenomenon because homeless people are more numerous, more geographically concentrated, and more visible in urban areas. However, people experience the same difficulties associated with homelessness and housing distress in America's small towns and rural communities as they do in urban areas. In urban areas, estimates commonly rely on counts of persons using services. However, by this measure, homeless persons in rural areas are likely substantially undercounted due to the lack of rural service sites, the difficulty capturing persons who do not use homeless services, the limited number of researchers working in rural communities, and the minimal incentive for rural providers to collect data on their clients. Rural homelessness, like urban homelessness, is the result of poverty and a lack of affordable housing, and research has shown the odds of being poor are between 1.2 and 2.3 times higher for people in non-metropolitan areas than those in metropolitan areas. Additionally, 1 in 5 non-metro counties are classified as high poverty areas, having a poverty rate of 20% or higher, while only 1 in 20 metro counties are defined as such. When considering this population, recognizing likely vulnerabilities will be helpful in focusing on their needs and establishing a plan to assist. These vulnerabilities include limited or no access to transport. The homeless are less likely to be able to access evacuations or safe meeting points in time to receive shelter. Limited or no access to housing or structures that can be temperature controlled or structurally modified to increased safety. Limited or no access to extra resources such as protective gear, a radio, extra food and clothing, and maps. Limited or no access to mainstream computer communication devices for early warning systems. Inaccessible and changing locations which cannot be easily accessed or reached by emergency service personnel. Low levels of literacy affect nearly 3/4 of the homeless community. And lastly, pre-existing physical, mental, and emotional stressors that make it understanding and remembering information difficult, heighten the impacts of a disaster, and lead to a poor recovery. People experiencing homelessness typically have limited resources and likely have past exposure to traumatic events. Therefore, they may be at higher risk of adverse physical and psychological reactions following a public health emergency or disaster. As a disaster responder, it is important to consider a trauma-informed approach. A trauma-informed approach to disaster response acknowledges past trauma and the current impact it may have on the lives of anyone receiving services or support. Sensitivity to trauma can improve communication between responders and the homeless and facilitate compliance with the public health directives. A National Center on Family Homelessness reports that 92% of homeless American mothers have experienced severe physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime. And a traumatic 83% of homeless children have been exposed to at least one serious act of violence by age 12. Of the reported hate crimes committed against homeless people between 1999 and 2010 in the U.S., 27% of these cases were fatal. When planning for homeless individuals and families during disasters, include people with expertise in providing services to the homeless in planning activities and exercises. Understand that homeless individuals and families often have a significant trauma history prior to this emergency or disaster. Educate service providers about trauma and how it impacts a person's physical and behavioral health. Train providers to be mindful of common triggers for traumatic symptoms, which include loud noises, small spaces, lack of privacy, and chaotic or disorganized surroundings. Help recognize that shock, denial, anger, acceptance, and coping are all stages by which individuals can come to terms with trauma. A homeless child or adult may be in any one of these stages when a disaster occurs. Provide information about where it is safe, as well as where it may be unsafe, and to seek shelter during a disaster. Make trauma-specific assessment resources available to service providers, such as tools that screen for anxiety, depression, or substance abuse. Build the capacity to connect homeless disaster survivors with experienced service providers for follow-up care after their physical and psychological well-being has been safeguarded. Some examples of practical advice for rural homeless population for disaster preparedness include how to protect your belongings, such as placing them in a plastic trash bag or Ziploc baggie. Where to get and store food. Likely post-disaster location sites distributing food. The importance of staying hydrated and details on safe water consumption following a disaster. Ways to keep cool, such as wetting a face cloth or lying under a wet sheet and having a fan blowing on you. Important health-related information, such as alcohol is not hydration. Signs and symptoms of dehydration. Additional examples of practical advice and support for people living in rural areas include fire safety, basic first aid, learning how to identify safe spots, such as higher grounds for floods, sound structures for tornadoes and hurricanes, and clear areas for fires. Who and how to connect with a trusted person or persons in an emergency, such as registering for 211 before a disaster occurs, how to contact 911, or contacting support workers when telephone communications are down. And finally, a way of marking their camp or home location in rural and remote areas could be difficult for emergency responders to locate them, so a significant marking of these sites is important. A trauma-informed response to a disaster could include a sense of physical, or should include a sense of physical and emotional safety as an essential first step to building effective, helpful relationships. Safe physical environments include well-lit spaces, security systems if available, the ability for consumers to lock doors, visible posting of their rights, cultural familiar decorations, and child-friendly spaces. Practices that help to create a safe environment, emotional environment include providing consistent, predictable, and respectful responses to consumers across an agency, asking consumers what does and does not work for them, being clear about how consumer information is used, providing opportunities for consumers to engage in their own cultural and spiritual rituals. Supporting customer controls in choice situations that leave people feeling helpless, fearful, or out of control, remind them of their past traumatic experience and leave them feeling re-traumatized. Ways to help consumers regain a sense of control over their daily lives include keeping consumers well informed about all aspects of their care, providing opportunities for consumers to give input about the decisions about how a program is run, allowing for consumer control over their own space and physical belongings, having clear boundaries around and giving advance notice for room checks, ensuring that consumers have input into their service goals, and using interventions respectful of and specific to cultural backgrounds. Maintaining an overall awareness of and respect for basic human rights and freedoms regardless of housing status. I hope this information has been helpful. For location-specific plans to your community, contact your most local Red Cross or the City Community's Emergency Management Office. Thank you and have a blessed day.